Good evening, and welcome to Teaching Democracy in Poland and the U.S. in the 21st Century, Challenges and Prospects. This event is sponsored by the Center for Polish Studies, the Global Programs Office, and the History and Political Science Department at Daemen College. Additional funders for the Kosciuszko Visiting Professor are the Kosciuszko Foundation, the Permanent Chair of Polish Culture at Canisius College, and Canisius College. The keynote address and the roundtable discussion feature scholars who have participated in the faculty exchange program between the American Studies Center at the University of Warsaw and Daemen College. Initiated in 2017, this program is expanding in 2021 to include faculty from Canisius College. At this point, I'd like to thank Professor Margaret Stefanski at Canisius College for spearheading this effort to collaborate with us as we move forward. While this event focuses on current challenges in teaching democracy, the participants will share insights gained from teaching in Poland and the U.S. since the 1980s. Let me introduce our keynote speaker, talk a little bit about his accomplishments, and I'll also introduce and talk about the accomplishments of our really excellent roundtable panelists. The keynote speaker is Professor Bogdan Szklarski, PhD, Professor of Political Science at the University of Warsaw, and this year's Kosciuszko Visiting Professor of Polish Studies at Daemen College and Canisius College. Bogdan Szklarski is a specialist in the study of democracy, political leadership, and political culture. He is currently Kosciuszko Foundation Visiting Professor at Daemen College and Canisius College, and he has served as chair of the American Studies Center at the University of Warsaw from 2012 to 2016. There, he was also co-founder and chair of the Leadership Research Laboratory. He has also served as the head of the Department of Political Science at Collegium Civitas from 1997 to 2007. He has taught at many universities in the U.S. and other countries, most recently at the University of South Carolina in 2020. He is a past recipient of the Kosciuszko Foundation grant and author of several books and over 50 book chapters and articles. We'll be turning to Professor Szklarski for his keynote address in just a few moments, but let me also introduce and provide a brief sketch of the other excellent panelists that we have tonight. Professor Robert Moraes is Distinguished Professor of English at Daemen College. He is the author and editor of 6 books on contemporary fiction, as well as numerous essays on the same subject. He has previously taught in Warsaw from 1985 to 1987, and again as part of this current exchange in 2018. He's also taught in Beijing in 2010, 2012, and 2015. He serves on the editorial boards of 2 journals, Critique, Studies in Contemporary Fiction, and Symbiosis, Studies in Transatlantic Literature and Culture. And he has been academic advisor on 2 recent volumes in the Contemporary Literary Criticism series. He is currently completing a book-length study of a subject that changes faster than he can write about, post-devolution Scottish fiction. Our next panelist is Professor Lisa K. Parshall, PhD, Professor of Political Science at Daemen College. She is a specialist in American politics and public policy with expertise on state and local government. She is a public policy fellow currently at the Rockefeller Institute of Government in Albany, New York, and the immediate past president of the Northeastern Political Science Association. Dr. Parshall has taught 2 courses for the American Studies Center in Warsaw, including one currently this semester, as part of the faculty exchange that we mentioned a few moments ago. In 2017, she taught Democracy in America, Critical Perspectives in residence in Warsaw, and this semester her course online is American Federalism, Cooperation and Conflict in Contemporary Politics. She is the author of Reforming the Presidential Nominating Process, Front-Loading's Consequences and the National Primary Solution, that's in 2018, published by Routledge, and co-author of Directing the Whirlwind, the Trump Presidency and the Destruction of the Administrative State, that's from 2020, Peter Lang is the publisher. And also the Icelandic Federalist Papers, that's from 2018, along with David Carello and others, published by the Berkeley Public Policy Press. Dr. Parshall is also a member of ICON, the International Society of Public Law, and also currently a Fulbright Specialist Scholar. Finally, our third panelist is Jay Wendland. Dr. Jay Wendland, PhD, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and the Honors Program Director at Daemen College, is a specialist in American politics with expertise in political behavior and presidential nominations. In 2020, he taught the American presidential nomination process virtually for the American Studies Center in Warsaw as part of the exchange with that institution. His most recent publications include the book Campaigns That Matter: The Importance of Campaign Visits in Presidential Nominating Contests, published in 2017 by Lexington. Rallying Voters, a multi-level approach to understanding voter decision-making in the 2016 presidential nominating contest. That's from 2019 in the Journal of Political Marketing. And a more recent article even than that in 2020, A Heartbeat Away, Popular Culture's Role in Teaching Presidential Succession. That's in Dialogue, the Interdisciplinary Journal of Popular Culture and Pedagogy. My name is Professor Andrew Wise. I'm currently the director of the Center for Polish Studies here at Daemen and professor of history. I also participated in this exchange in 2019. So collectively, our keynote speaker and our panelists have an abundant amount of experience and knowledge about this topic. Once again, thank you all very much for joining this very interesting roundtable called Teaching Democracy in Poland and the U.S. in the 21st century. As you will note in the chat group, you can ask questions at any time. Myself and my colleague, Professor Hammer, will be looking through these and organizing these and passing these on to the panelists who will answer these questions at the end of this event. I'd like to also, just before I forget, thank Joe Robbins, who helped organize and publicize this event, and also Tom W., who is the technical expert who is masterminding this event behind the scenes. So without further ado, let me once again introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Boran Szklarski. Professor Szklarski?
Hello, Andrew. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I'll tell you what a great opportunity it is to rarely do we have an opportunity like this to speak about things we love to do, and we've been doing for like 33 years now, and make it academic. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me. Thank you, Daemen. Thank you, Canisius. Thank Kościuszka for making my trip here possible. And in this COVID world, the opportunity to go into the classroom and teach in person, where most of the world is doing it online, you can't even know what a treat it was, and it is, because I'm still teaching. So you know, to establish a little bit of my credibility to be here. Yes, I've been teaching politics for 33 years now, more than 33 years now. About 14 years of this in the United States, teaching American students, and the rest of it, it's mostly Polish students at the American Studies Center in Warsaw or at some other universities, including Collegium Civitas, which I'm closely associated with. It's also in Warsaw. So I'm teaching politics, American politics, East European politics, and have been doing it for long time. So now is a chance for me to share some thoughts with you about that, teaching democracy after authoritarianism. Polish politics, democracy, American politics, all these things will pop up. I have a short presentation which I will be using. If you don't mind, I will now turn on the sharing of the screen, and we will go into my presentation. So it is the reflections of an Americanist and a political scientist. This is basically what you will see during my presentation. I hope it's visible to everyone. So I would like to, since I was involved in teaching, not only as a teacher but also as a creator of programs, graduate, undergraduate. So I would like to share with you my experiences from the administrative side too, and then the I will talk about certain difficulties which we encounter when we teach democracy in the post-authoritarian world. And in the end, well, I'll talk about the contents of teaching, context of teaching, the role of context. We'll reflect on this: who is teaching, how it's done in Poland, because that's this experience you're mostly interested in, the American experience, you know, firsthand. Uh, we'll talk a little bit about the students who come to the university and how they are prepared to study democracy. And then I will talk about my observations from coming from the experience of teaching American politics, and I probably these you will find sometimes funny and sometimes enlightening. I hope. Yes. Uh, the key question which we must ask when teaching the democracy is that, you know, how culture specific is democracy? When can it be translated to another setting, institutional, cultural, historical setting? Is it possible? And assuming that it is, what kind of preparation do we need if we want to make it efficient? Yes. Uh, the assumption which I hold for this talk is that when teaching democracy, the best case scenario is to have a match between textbook information, classroom contents, and out of classroom content. So when there is a mismatch between these things, so the textbook contents, the classroom, and out of the classroom context, then we run into a situation when a lot depends on a lecturer. Then a lecturer has to step in and use his or her creativity to compensate for any difficulties that might spring from that. Uh, Now, I propose that in this uh, history of teaching democracy in Poland, we witness four clear phases of that process. I will reflect a little on how democracy was taught in the authoritarian setting. Then there is a specificity of the period of the early transformation. And I'm very glad that Bill is with us because he experienced teaching American government, American politics in general. I assume, or at least talked about this in the 80s, so I'm not alone with this experience. So then the early transformation, then the period of consolidated democracy, mostly of the liberal kind, and then eventually at the end, the current phase, which we may call the post-liberal phase of development of democracy, which is reflected in the way democracy is taught or in the assumptions which we have to make when going into classroom teaching the democracy. And the the textbooks which are or were available in those periods of time. And well, I have a table that kind of includes all this information, but obviously since it is a table that has small print, it's not presentable in the form of a presentation. So you will have to excuse me that I will be jumping back and forth and kind of moving across columns and verses in a table which you do not see. But the textbook situation is also quite interesting, because in the communist times, obviously, we did not have, and I'm talking about now, uh, official places where democracy would be taught, that is university. Yes. So there were almost none indigenous textbooks which would uh, mm, teach about, which would have relatively good unbiased content about democracy. Not that you should understand that, at least in the Polish case, it was not the case that you had this ideological propaganda fed to the students at the Department of Political Science all the time. No, I think government was much smarter than that. There was a lot of interaction between Poland and the outside world, and we were not in a bubble that would separate us from the rest of the world. Nonetheless, the democracy that was taught about quite often was viewed in a critical way, and the texts, the Western texts, American texts, the texts which, for instance, the American embassy provided in the departments of English, for instance, or the political science, all in English, that was piece of propaganda. Yes, because if you looked at them, it's American democracy looked like an ideal place in the world, and everyone should like to come and just be here because everything was perfect and worked according to some ideal order. But that had a message. Yes, it was supposed to compensate for the alleged communist critique of the democracy that was assumed to be fed to the students by the official courses. Um, there were there were occasionally books that were brought by professors who traveled abroad, and usually they treasured those books and considered them their own personal treasure and possession, and they wouldn't share the books with other professors who teach comparative politics or international relations. Well, those were the times. Yes, uh, then we started having translations of classics. At first, classics. This comes in the early transition period. One more thing. A lot of there was a special kind of a book, not a textbook, but a book which you could use in the communist times, and though they were written by Polish journalists who were correspondents either in Washington, New York, or in Western countries. And they would quite often, after they returned, they would have written a book about their experience, which contained quite a lot of information about real life politics in those political systems. So they were not systematic. They didn't have theoretical parts, but they had a lot of life, and with a professor who had this theoretical preparation, they could be used as an illustration of the processes. Remember, this is still long before internet, no films, no audio visuals, so you're relying on what's done in the classroom. Then, as I said, translations appeared, and the funny thing is, a lot of times those were at first classics. This is good time. We translate classic textbooks from which we teach about transformation, we teach about the character of democracy, in most cases, parliamentary democracy, European type democracy. American system is too unique to use it as a reference point for a country that is going through transformation, trying to build a democracy of its own. What American textbooks were very useful for, they were useful for all the things that taught about articulation of interest, the input side of politics, the parties, well, maybe parties not so much, but interest groups, civic activism, types of voters, all those political culture. These texts came from American scholars. There's a funny anecdote here. The most popular textbook uh, that was used that contained articles translated from American journals about about particular aspects of political system. It was published edited by Jerzy Szczupaczyński. Can't have a more Polish name. And it was called Szczupaczyński 1 and Szczupaczyński 2 because there were two volumes. Volume 1 contained absolute gems, wonderful texts that you would like to use in your classroom. But unfortunately, after first edition, which came out, I think in what, like 3,000 copies or something like this, when 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 us teachers, when we were asking the publisher, well, why don't you have a second edition? Why don't you print more? The publisher said, sorry, I can't because we ran into the legal problems. We didn't have permission to use some of the texts. So copyright violation, which is a part of early transformation, I think, also hit the academe and the area of political science. And so whoever has the old book, it's usually standing somewhere on the shelf today and in pretty used format, very used format. Then the next stage, we started getting uh, indigenous post-communist textbooks, a lot of which were imitations or adaptations, were paraphrases. They did not yet have they didn't have the originality that you might expect, but that they were indigenous. They were local. They were produced by Polish professors, and then we started using them in the classrooms, teaching political science, teaching democracy. And then in the consolidated phase of democracy, we have very good empirical studies often, although it when I say empirical, I mean well, rarely do we have the money to do research, original research in Western societies, polling, and so when I say indigenous, original, the use of Western databases is employed by Polish scholars, but they use them in accordance with all kinds of prescribed and absolutely legitimate research method. This is just normal political science. Yes, one thing which differentiates it from Western scholars, Polish scholars can rarely have the opportunity to study the societies and the democratic processes on the spot. Yes. And then obviously there are Western originals, which today are quite popular and often used as the student population. Most of the students in social sciences read English, they understand English texts, and so there are no problems using those texts, which means that Polish political science texts tend to focus more on the empirical side of the working, how democracy works, with Polish and East European examples as a reference point, as a background. Uh, Now, the second type of development in the next column, the lecturers, how did the body of lecturers change over time, those who teach democracy? Yes. Initially, you have quite ideological political scientists who, if not themselves communists, but they understand, especially at departments of political science, that they are supposed to present democracy in the uh, light of dominant ideology. Yeah, so you would focus on working class parties, you would social movements, you would accentuate social problems in Western democracies. This is where ideology would manifest. This is how ideology would manifest itself. When it comes to teaching about institutions, that was much better, and you hardly ever had a strong ideological content in that. If you were lucky, you had in communist times you had a political scientist who was non-ideological, who had some English literature that he or she used and would teach you as well as possible without the ideological content. In most cases, such people would be located at the Department of Sociology rather than political science. This is a feature of Polish political science or social sciences. And when it comes to teaching about politics and democratic institutions, that the best courses with least interference, least intrusion, least supervised by the authorities who would be looking for some ideological content, were taught at the Department of Sociology. So, in fact, Polish political science after 1989 is built primarily by sociologists who specialize in the area which we call political sociology. Later, the Group D, the post-communist shifters or converts at the Department of Political Science, they obviously understood that all ideological content had to be jettisoned and you had to teach in accordance with what students knew was happening, and uncensored information was coming, obviously, and access to texts and literature was much more widespread, original texts. So those converts from ideological, the Department of Political Science, they sometimes, funny thing is that a lot of those who were previously considered ideological teachers, they found a new niche in the sphere of political marketing and communication. This is the area which was hardly ever taught in the communist period because of the nature of the communist system, yes, which did not have much appreciation for articulation of interests and the input side. So it was quite easy to establish your reputation in the new area of political marketing and political communication, and some of the most notable names of those previously ideological scholars moved into that area. And then naturally, as things should have happened, we developed a totally indigenous group, homegrown group of post-communist new breed of political scientists. No longer you're looking at sociology, you're talking now about the departments of political science, modern methodologies, and very contemporary, very proper political science practiced by them. A small group of people are the imports from outside, the Polish scholars who were educated in the West, who returned home, and they also were employed, some of them employed at Polish universities, and they were teaching obviously in accordance to how they were taught in Western institutions. And then the last group, but a very important group of visiting scholars from the West as the academe opened up. We have a whole array of scholars coming from Western American in institutions. Yes. So the question is, uh, well, in order to accentuate the differences, because if I were to summarize the development of the forms and contents of of teaching of democracy, we move from slightly ideological and biased contents to very open and comparative contents, and just like in Western institutions. In terms of who teaches, we also develop. We go through the similar stages of development and end up with many bright, able-bodied, methodologically versed in all kinds of methodologies, political scientists. There is, however, one weakness of political science and teaching about democracy, and this is a leftover from the communist times. That is, the quantitative studies of politics are still done more often. You will see them more often done at the Department of Sociology, because sociology uses much more easily, it has greater ease, and students are taught this in greater detail, called quantitative methods of analysis. Whereas political science in Poland tends to be dominated by qualitative scholarship, teachers who use those methods. So Polish students who graduate from Department of Political Science are not as able, as capable, as fluent in quantitative methodologies as Polish sociology department graduates are. But that's kind of a note on the side. And so that's the development. Yes. Now let's talk a little about the problems which we encounter. And a good way to talk about these problems is to use examples from the field of teaching American politics and American government as an example of democracy, with continuously with that one restriction, that we don't treat in Poland American political system, its institutional form, as any model to imitate or to follow. This is parliamentary democracy is the democracy which you teach about, basically also because this is the type of democracy which we have in Poland, with slightly more powerful presidency, but that's not the place to discuss this. Now, we we before I talk about the certain problems which are highlighted here, let me go through the ideas which are a result of my experience of teaching American government and democracy to Polish students, to Polish and American students. And I'll start with the Polish and then talk about American students. And you can assume when you enter a classroom to teach a course about parties, interest groups, communication, elections, you can assume that students will have some knowledge of history and world history as context. That's a good thing. You can count on this is Polish students, you can count on students being able to contextualize, even though in a minimal way, but still able to do this, the textbook knowledge with information from the news. You must cautiously, number three, you must cautiously use comparative references to Polish reality because of its specificity. Yes? But you should be even more cautious about this when teaching about teaching American students about democracy. The method of teaching, what is welcome, is storytelling. Storytelling is encouraged, especially if you want to achieve understanding of the class. Remember, this is the result of the fact that when you're teaching democracy, especially its Western version, the students are not immersed in that democracy. So the role of the teacher is to serve kind of like Abe Lincoln and offer the narratives about things happening and how things happen. Uh, Next, politics may be seen as an isolated sphere. Lecturer must make students aware of its interdependentness, especially with macroeconomic phenomena. That is important. That what teaching in Poland, in the democracy in Poland, is that political sphere is kind of isolated from the social sphere, society, or from economy. These areas tend to be, well, there is overlapping, and obviously students are aware of it, but this overlapping is, you must remind them about this, and the teacher must be prepared to do this. Uh, you must count on certain susceptibility to conspiratorial explanations because of the generally because of the lower trust in government. And the next point, which comes along with that, uh, secret services, the so-called służby, yes, the secret services, are attributed more agency than in the American case. Uh, Whenever you have a hole in the narrative, something is hard to explain, we don't have evidence, Polish students studying democracy are quick to jump in with the conclusion that someone's pulling the strings from behind the scene. Secret service, secret police, someone is instrumental in making things happen where we don't have when we don't have the data or evidence. Uh, when you're teaching democracy, you should make instrumental uses of historical references. They are welcome, as long as they explain current reality. Remember that you are a political scientist, not a historian, so it is justified that you provide students with examples that may not be current, they may be from the past, but as long as they illustrate a process which you are teaching about, there's nothing wrong with being kind of ahistorical in this. You're not a historian. Chronology may not be so important. Remember about this. Avoid when it comes to testing, avoid test banks which come with textbooks which are translations or adaptations or imitations of textbooks from the West, because these test banks, it's teaching American government. That's avoid this. You must avoid that because they make use of the context which is unknown to your students. So you should filter out such questions or make them, rephrase them if you're using test banks for testing. Polish students would like to be given essays, opportunities to write longer essays and analytical essays. However, when it comes to term papers, the traditional length of a paper, American paper, 15 to 20 pages, they would consider it a very, very long paper, even at the graduate level, the MA studies. That's what an American professor must remember when going to Poland to teach democracy, and I'm sure we will hear about this from my colleagues in a moment. Now, my experience of teaching East European politics and democracy to American students contains recommendations like this. Students must be encouraged to get out of the box of American system, including the terminology. But using comparisons to US are essential as a method. When teaching about other countries, assume this, your students, American students, will know very little and have no way of finding out about these countries unless they make an effort. The news programs, the most popular websites which students visit do not offer them that information easily. That has to be searched. It is different in Poland, where international news and European news takes up a lot of space in the news programs, and in the papers and in the internet information portals. It is welcome to engage in narrative style of teaching, describe other cases, history, institutions, etc., as Abe Lincoln, as I said, teaching as storytelling. Lower the informative content if you want students to understand other systems. Don't make things too complicated. First, make sure that they understand things and then go deeper. Kind of sounds kind of like a cliche here, yes. You may count on awareness of connectedness between economic and political developments, greater than it is the case in Poland. Make sure that testing focuses on understanding too, not just reproduction of knowledge. Uh, you may count on ethnic roots in America as a starting point for interest, for term papers, presentations. This is something which can often draw students to a topic when they can use it to research or part of their own heritage with this. So country studies, yes, of or system element studies from a country which they have some heritage in. Uh, don't count on knowledge of world history to understand global processes. Teaching must be ahistorical when it comes to teaching about other countries. But ahistoricism, on the other hand, does not preclude you from using historical examples instrumentally. Use them out of context, but only when they can illustrate current phenomena as well. Just like it was in case of the Polish students. So general suggestion: tell stories, use narratives, use audiovisual materials. Be aware of the presence of ideological biases, as both American and Polish societies are highly polarized. Respect student values and be prepared for students to come to classroom as very opinionated people. But make it a point to open them to the alternatives to the bubble they may be living in. This is particularly important in current times where those bubbles are particularly noticeable. Be aware that students might be opinionated. This is both for Polish and American classrooms. Yes. Avoid revealing your own views in class, as it may lead to the loss of authority and loss of legitimacy of the information you provide. In Polish case, this is very important. Students will put you in a tribe that is, if they don't agree with that kind of a message, you may lose their attentiveness, and they may filter out the information which you provide. Comparative method is encouraged, obviously. Exposing dissimilarities between systems works particularly well for alerting students to mistakes they might commit in their analysis if they stick to their own systems. Show them that textbooks are not truths. Show that's a post-authoritarian system. It was particularly important to do this. And show that the same phenomenon can be viewed, explained differently by various scholars to encourage critical thinking. Remember that you're in the business of socialization, yes, all the time. And okay, now let me, since the time's running up, and I will talk maybe now about things. Okay, one thing which is good, which is encouraged in teaching democracy in post-authoritarian system, is to use all kinds of creative, like role play, workshop, group work in classroom, to introduce them to negotiate, converse, share opinions, bargain, encourage them to change their opinions, defending views, recognizing other opinions, and teach tolerance for criticism. In the post-authoritarian order, although now we have a generation who have not even been born in authoritarian system, but the political system in which they are immersed still looks sometimes like an authoritarian system, by imposing its rigid intellectual, ready-made answers, kind of ideological answers to as explanations of phenomena which we watch. That's a product of polarization, which trickles down from parents to students, or sometimes begins with students and goes up to parents. And and encourage students to do small research projects to teach them individualism, responsibility, and creativity and self-sufficiency. And that's both encouraged, I think, here when teaching comparative politics as well as it is in Poland. Now, speaking of comparative politics, here are the few in the remaining slides, just a few of those. You will see very practical problems that I encountered, that my colleagues encounter. I would be interested to hear if my colleagues in the panel encounter the same problems when they go to Poland to teach students about American politics, because this is American politics we're talking about at the moment. You begin with the problem with the very basic term of government. Because in Poland, and I think as well as in Europe, government means just the executive. This is the first connotation which students have when you say government. A lot of American textbooks, the American Government 101, American Politics 101, obviously make use of the word government as something much broader, where decisions are made. Decision-making bodies, those who influence decision-making bodies. We speak of Washington more like a government, yes, and some even include interest groups and in government, and this is very different in Poland. That you have to take it into account. When you use the word party, a Polish student will assume that you're talking about something more coherent, hierarchically organized, different than American parties. The same goes for party membership. You're expecting dues, regular meetings, you're expecting following the hierarchy, following the party leaders. Party leadership is much more important. And than it is in the case of United States, and probably I would say 80 or maybe more percent of American students have no idea who the chair of the formal chair of Republican or Democratic Party is. Yes, in Europe, we know who the chairs or heads of the parties are. So when you say political party, Democratic Party, people will assume that Joe Biden is a head of the party, that he controls the institution to a much larger extent than it
Pro-
actually is the case.
Prof- Professor
Yes.
Shklarsky, Professor Shklarsky, I just wanted to, excuse me very much for interjecting. I wanted to see if we could, in a few moments, move on to the other panelists and then circle back for some additional comments by you after they've commented on your interesting presentation thus far.
Absolutely, absolutely. I can stop here, and we can go around, and I just had a few more comments about how certain concepts are different. But let me just finish, if I may finish, without talking in detail about the American democracy. But a general a general problem which you run into when teaching democracy to Polish students, a technical one. Now, the two key terms have, and when you translate them, in one is causes problems in Poland, the other one causes problems in the United States. The word power doesn't have a good translation into Polish. Which you may say it's surprising. How can a key term, a political science term, have not the same meaning? Because in Polish, it is more, when you translate it directly into Polish, it means władza, and it means authority, legal, formal authority. But when coming to America and you teach about about European politics and European democracy, you run into a serious problem with the difficulty with the translation of the term state. And I'm not talking only about the fact that in America this means a state like New York as a unit of government. No, but the very concept of state as a point of reference with its historical institutional connotations. The connotation of a state is very different in Europe and in United States, and it may cause some problems. And I'll be interested to hear from my colleagues what their observations are on that in that regard. So this is it. I'll be happy to share my thoughts with you in the conversation, in the question and answer, if we have time for that. And I will. I'm now all ears, going to listen to my colleagues as they share their experience. Thank you very
Perfect
much.
timing, Professor Shklarski. That was I really enjoyed the final portion actually about translation. So I may have some follow-up questions for you about that. So thank you very much for your excellent presentation. We're going to hear more from you. I'd like to now run through the panel and allow those panelists to comment briefly, and then we also have a Q&A portion. If you're in the audience, please send in your questions in the chat function, and I and Professor Hammer will be reading those and helping collate those. Let me once again reintroduce Professor Robert Moraes, whom I spoke about earlier, having taught in Poland, as well as in China many times, in Poland in the 1980s, and most recently in Poland in, was it 2018, I believe, Professor Moraes. So let me turn it over to Professor Moraes for his comment, and then we'll run through the panel. Thank you, Professor Moraes.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, and hello to everybody who's out there on the panel. Bowden, thank you very much for your remarks. I ought to point out at the very outset that I'm the odd duck here. We have a historian who is sharing the panel and put this together. We have 3 political scientists, and then we have me. And my area is literature, particularly contemporary literature. In terms of my teaching in Poland, it was contemporary American literature, as you define contemporary American literature, in 1985 to 1987. And then in 2018, when that literature had changed, also Poland had changed hugely. And to be away from that country for as many years as Bowden has been teaching political science, that is to say, I think it was like 32, 33 years, presented a very dramatic change to me when I landed at a very different airport than the one I took off from in 1987. So I'm going to talk about really the literature and how it was received, what American literature, contemporary American literature, tended to represent in Poland to my students at that time. One thing to realize is that all my students in 1985 to 1987 were Polish students. That was largely, but not entirely, the case in 2018. Erasmus meant that we had students coming from elsewhere in the European Union, bringing their own perspectives with them, and making for, I'm not going to say a livelier discussion. It wasn't livelier. It was just a different kind of discussion because of that kind of access. And access is really not just something that Bowden mentioned earlier, but really a very important difference between the literature and what it represented in Poland in the middle of the 1980s, shortly after martial law, and what it came to represent 3 decades later, when students had access to things via the net. Amazon was available through Germany, now I think available right in Poland itself, and you had Netflix and all the rest in 2018. Whereas the resources that students could draw on in the 1980s were very limited. When I first arrived in Poland at the airport, my university shepherd greeted me with the words, "Welcome to good gray Warsaw." He was my university shepherd then. He later became a well-known Polish poet, Andrzej Sosnowski. And those words, I guess because they were the first words, really impressed itself on my mind. Not in terms of the experiences I had, which I would say were uniformly positive. I might leave out Chernobyl from that list of universally positive. But certainly my dealings with colleagues, and especially with the students that I had. But my memories of the place tend to be kind of dark. Maybe it's because of a higher latitude, too. What I didn't realize before I went, because I had done very little preparation other than in my field of contemporary American literature, was knowing very much, except through a few people, about how American literature was being received in Poland. The more I learned, the more I realized that American literature changed its status and its meaning from the 1950s right through the 1980s, has continued to do that through the second decade of the, now we're the third decade of the 21st century. So the American literature that I taught fell into kind of two broad areas. And they're summed up by a line from one of Nathaniel Hawthorne's stories, The Maypole of Merrymount. Jollity and gloom were contending for an empire. The empire was American, contemporary American literature, and the jollity were the kind of writers that were especially appreciated in Poland at that time, partly because faculty in the English departments, not just at Warsaw, but elsewhere, were particularly interested in the more innovative, experimental writers of that time, who very often fell under the label metafictionist or postmodernist. And I think one of the things that really appealed to the students as well as to the faculty who were dealing in these same areas at a very early stage in their careers was how liberating these writers tended to be. Bowden was talking about how you can assume that Polish students will have a grasp of history that is considerably more extensive and perhaps even deeper than American students will have. And here were writers who were taking on history of various kinds. It might be John Gardner with a mock epic novel like Grendel, taking on the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf, but more particularly Robert Coover, who just a few years before I got there had visited Poland. And he takes on American history, Cold War history, in his bicentennial novel, The Public Burning. All this was very exciting, I think, for the students. You had writers like Donald Barthelme, who would create these odd sort of objects, bringing together lots of material, not creating a coherent narrative of them. And certainly one of the things that impressed me earliest in my time in Poland was how important in the study of literature literary history was. By the middle of the 1980s in the United States, literary history had become more or less passé. And maybe that accounts for why American students tend to have very little sense of history as well. But this kind of gleeful, disruptive handling of history, including literary history, was one of the things that made that writing so significant. And keep in mind that the students, as Bowden was pointing out, very often got their access to American text by having American teachers and scholars go there, especially if they were like me, a Fulbright lecturer, because the Fulbright program gave me a lot of money to get books and distribute them to the English Institute, the American unit, American Literature unit of the English Institute at the University of Warsaw. And these became really prized, precious objects that the students, had to share, something I think American students tend not to understand very well about sharing things. And they were in very limited supply, and whatever the supply was tended to represent what American literature was at that time. The other thing I wanted to do, though, with my American literature class was the gloom side, taking on writers who were highly critical of life in the United States. People like Joan Didion, John Cheever, even Don DeLillo, whose novel White Noise had just come out in 1985, but thanks to the Fulbright budget, I could get copies of to the Warsaw University and to the students who were there, and to present this kind of very critical view of the United States. That was met with a bit less enthusiasm than the postmodern metafictionist writers who were gleefully dismantling things a great deal. So that this issue really of access was tied to also how students perceived what America was, particularly at a time when the political situation in Poland seemed to indicate there was really no way out. The communism was there, and communism was going to continue there. What would happen, of course, in 1989 was something that I think most people were not prepared for. When I arrived in 2018, the situation had changed radically. First of all, I wasn't at the English Institute and the American Literature Unit, but was at a different function of the University of Warsaw, and that was the American Studies program that Bowden had chaired up until very recently. And the students there, as I mentioned before, were mainly Polish, but not exclusively Polish. They had access to literature and things about America. And while they were still very enthusiastic about the material they were reading, and in some ways wished that there was less of it being assigned on a kind of twice a week basis, this wasn't prized, precious material for them. And this seemed to me to reflect, particularly during the 5 or so weeks that I was in Warsaw, increasingly seemed to reflect the situation of literature itself in America. In the 1980s, 70s, and 60s, this was literature that grew out of the kind of countercultural social activism that was there in the 60s and the 1970s. And it meant something in America as well. It also, though, was becoming increasingly, even by the 1980s, a subject matter that was becoming more and more associated with the university and increasingly less associated, I think, with the general population. By 2018, and certainly in 2021, that is even more the case right now. In the 1940s, there were a handful of creative writing programs in the United States, and creative writing programs almost only exist in the United States and a few other English language countries, particularly the United Kingdom. And I'm going to come to a conclusion in about 1 minute, because I see that Andrew is letting me know that I've probably not only reached my time limit, but surpassed it as well. But the American literature, particularly the short stories, what I was teaching in 2018, was increasingly something that was associated with a segment of the population, university educated, and also educated in creative writing programs, and often producing this writing for other people who had their MFAs, the Masters in Fine Arts. And it became less reflective of the United States. And I'll end there, and if there are questions later on, we can entertain those as well. So thank you for your time. Looking forward to passing things on at this point.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. When you see me pop up on the screen, I guess that's a scary image for everyone normally, and especially tonight if you're running over. But thank you, Bob, very much. And I'd like to now turn to Professor Lisa Parshall, whom I introduced earlier. She's a two-timer. She was there as the first exchange scholar on this program that we have directly with the American Studies Center in 2017. And now she's teaching virtually this semester. Professor Parshall?
Thank you, Dr. Wise. So as Dr. Wise had said at the outset, I've taught 2 courses for the ASC. So the first one was a course called Democracy in America, Critical Perspectives, in which we looked particularly at the treatment of Native Americans and African Americans in the U.S. democratic system. So the first citizens and the forced citizens of the United States. And I always think of the great Felix Cohen, the author of Modern Indian Law, saying that, the treatment of these groups more than any other they're the canary in the coal mine, kind of demarcates the point in American democracy where the air turns foul. So it was very interesting teaching students in Poland about Native Americans. I'm not a deep expert here, but one of the things that they had commented on was that they'd had very little exposure to Native Americans, and that's something that's absolutely true as well of U.S. students. I will tell one little story because I taught a similar class to my American students the semester prior, and there was a controversy in one of the Western states about whether or not to recognize the American genocide of the treatment of Native Americans. And I had conveyed this comment in the remarks to my U.S. citizens and got no reaction. And I conveyed the same remark to my Polish citizens, or Polish students rather. And the remark was of a legislator in Kansas, I believe it was. And she said, well, of course it's not a genocide because, Native Americans are still here, right? So it can't be a genocide. Well, my Polish students, of course, started laughing when they heard that remark. But so that tells you just a little bit about how context and appreciation for history can affect the reaction or receptivity of the students to the material. I'm currently teaching a course to try to cover the baffling complexities of American federalism. And so I'm covering it through looking at some contemporary conflicts. So looking at the Black Lives Matter movements, the racial protests, the 2020 election disputes. So Bodan spent some time talking about textbooks. For both of these classes, I basically had to invent my own textbooks. The other thing that I wanted just to remark on is the timing of my courses was really interesting because the first one was in May of 2017, and then now, of course, May 2021. So it really marked the exact same point of the Trump administration and now the Biden administration. And so my classes really have gotten to see the transition, a transition from a president who was really bent on deconstructing the federal government, as well as, I think, attacks or assaults on American democracy, and now the shift to the Biden administration, where you have a president really doubling down on kind of the power of the federal government. So these moments of transition are really exciting to teach in. I remember being in Poland in May was when the special prosecutor was appointed, named in the Trump investigation. And so it's really kind of exciting to be teaching these things as they're moving, but it's also, of course, challenging. Another thing I just wanted to comment on is in political science and in American law, this idea of democracies in peril and liberal democracies in peril, and that there are and is a consensus of warning signs. So I just pulled some terminology, right, that kind of have been popping up in literature and articles, but references to things like constitutional rot, democratic backsliding, emerging illiberal democracies, the new authoritarianism, abusive constitutionalism, deconsolidation, anti-constitutional populist backsliding, and democratic decay. So, in both courses, it's been really critical to understand the current moment we're sort of in and the larger threats that are going on to liberal democracy. And there is, of course, a consensus, I think, emerging that the terminology differs, but that democracy around the world is under threat. And one of the things that I think that we forget, and I think the terminology sort of shows us that there's a schism there, right? Some folks, if you talk about rot or decay, we think of it as sort of a natural retrograde, right? A backsliding, that there's this weakening, especially for older democracies that are sort of breaking down, versus some of the terminology reflects a very active deconstruction or challenges to democratic norms and the rule of law. And so there's always this question as well of sort of a motive, whether our current attacks on democracy or these problems that we're picking up are purposeful, or whether they reflect sort of, again, natural tendencies. But I think looking at the United States and Poland is very important because these are two really crucial case studies. And you could almost read them as kind of blueprints for how to erode democracy. And of course, one is an older, more established democracy, and one is a newer one. So comparatively, quite illuminating looking at the two of them side by side. And as Bodan mentioned, I think we should also point out that in US political science, American politics is its own subfield, where of course everywhere else it's taught comparatively, really. But the other thing that I think is important is to get students to think about the democratic dangers So citizens being susceptible to authoritarian rhetoric, the intolerance of minorities and democratic participation, the radicalization of beliefs, the legitimation of political violence, or the rejection of democratic processes and outcomes. So there are some real dangers to this erosion of democratic values. And I think that's something to kind of keep in mind as we're talking, that the stakes is very high. And then I wanted to address another point that Bodan had made. And that point is that I think it's also worth remembering that democracy itself is a very contested concept. And so when Bodan was talking about the periods, I saw some similarities, of course, without the context of the Polish experience. I think in political science, we moved from approaching democratic studies as a very normative kind of endeavor. And then, of course, with the behavioral revolution, we've moved to this point of a more empirical, quantitative attempt to study democracy. And I think it is to try to cross those cultural boundaries. Like, let's come up with some metrics to measure how democratic a regime is, or whether or not we have democratic backsliding. We need kind of some common metrics across places. And so as political science moved in this more positivist direction, some of that normative approach to democracy studies sort of disappeared out, and it's coming back again. And I think that that's very important because, again, democracy is a contested concept. And I think those empirical approaches that kind of try to distill democracies into, again, indicators or metrics, it kind of washes away the values of democracy and why we have democracy. And so that normative component can actually give us a much richer and deeper conversation about what the current state of democracy is, whether that's the current state of democracy in the United States or in Poland or around the world. So I'll just leave it there and then pass the baton on to Dr. Winland.
Thank you very much, Professor Parshall. I appreciate the discussion of the normative component of this, and it's a good time to again remind us of the Kosciuszko Foundation, both the national organization which has provided funding for Professor Szklarski to be here, as well as the Western New York chapter of the Kosciuszko Foundation that have helped organize and sponsor this event. Kosciuszko, of course, today's Kosciuszko was a freedom fighter for America as well as in Poland. So the topic of tonight's address is really especially significant in connection with the whole sponsorship of the Kosciuszko Foundation. So thank you for bringing us back to that crucial point. Let's turn it over now to Professor Wendland, who taught last year virtually. And Jay, what are your thoughts and what are your experiences in teaching democracy in both Poland and the United States?
All right, thank you, Andrew, and big thanks to everybody for participating and for organizing, Andrew, and to the Kosciuszko Foundation. Thanks for that reminder, for sponsoring, co-sponsoring this event. As Andrew mentioned, I taught virtually last summer as part of the faculty exchange, and due to COVID, I was prevented from actually traveling to Poland. So I'm the only one on this panel that has taught Poland students without actually having been to Poland, which was a real drawback last summer. I was very much looking forward to going and kind of immersing myself in the culture and having these wonderful experiences that everybody has discussed a bit. But when Andrew had initially asked me if I would be interested in doing something like this, and I was kind of thinking through what course I might offer, I immediately went to my expertise and what really drew me into political science, which was how we nominate presidents in this country. Compared to everywhere else, and how it's so uniquely American and fairly recent as well. So we we didn't start nominating presidents through party or through primaries and caucuses really until, at least they didn't hold major importance until the late 1960s, early 1970s. And so I pitched this idea, and Andrew said, sounds great. Let's pass it along and see how it goes. And it went over very well. And so I offered this course on the American presidential nomination process. And as I was putting together, this list of readings and everything I get excited about, and we're living through the American nomination process at the time I was teaching it. And I had made terrible predictions in my classes here in America about who was likely to win and how Biden didn't really stand a chance. And luckily, my prediction power looked a lot better to my Polish students than my American students. As by the time I started teaching the Polish course, Biden was clearly going to come out on top here. But one of the things I was forced to think about before this started, and it's something that kind of picks up where Bowden was talking about the definitions of political parties and how American politics has really adopted a different sort of definition of what a political party is versus the way other democracies kind of define and treat political parties. And so I made sure to carve out about a week's worth of time just kind of talking about how we as Americanists use the term political parties and how America treats political parties a little bit different from several of our Democratic friends, which to anybody that studies American politics knows that America has always liked to march to the beat of its own sort of drum here compared to other democratic nations. But I talked quite a bit about the nomination history and how we kind of saw power transferred from the more political elites in this country to place it in the hands of American voters, which has generally been the theme of American elections over time, is that we've seen really growing democratization among electoral politics in this country. We've seen, the right to vote granted to more and more people throughout U.S. history. We've taken the power of party nominations out of the hands of political elites, though among nomination scholars that's a little controversial in that some argue that the party still plays a big role in selecting the nominee. And to their credit, there is some truth to that. But we've taken the hands out of those political elites in the back room dealings to place it in the hands of the public. We're giving the public the right to vote on who the nominee is going to be. And I think we can all agree sometimes the public makes a good decision, sometimes it's a little bit off. But ultimately, we've seen this kind of growing sense of, or growing trend of democratization across elections. And so that's one of the things I was kind of the main theme of the course, is that really we've seen a lot of changes to the nomination system over time, but all of those changes have largely been done in an effort to democratize the process. I then went on to cover some of the rules of the process, the dynamics, some of the strategy that goes into trying to win a nominating contest, which is really what I'm most interested in terms of presidential nominations here in the US. But one of the other things I really wanted to highlight was, and this might go back to what Bowden had started with by talking about how democracy can be very culture specific, and that I feel at least my experience was that my students in Poland seemed to be much more interested and intrigued in this process than many of my American students, and that might just I don't know if it very well, as Bowden was talking, I was thinking it could very well be a cultural difference between Americans and Polish citizens, because Americans, at least my current students, they've grown up under this process and understand it to the extent that any American understands our political process. But they've grown up with it, they participated in it, hopefully. And it's just something they've started to kind of internalize, whereas kind of an outsider looking in perspective may raise some questions, concerns. I found that my Polish students were actually very much willing to critique our nominating process, whereas my American students are generally fairly standoffish when it comes to, well, how might we make this better? Or what are some ideas on how we could reform this? And my Polish students had a lot of fun answering that question, I think, based on some of the responses I had read to the question I had posed. Because unfortunately, when I had signed on to do this, I ended up teaching mostly asynchronously, given the time everything was set up. I wasn't about to, and I think my Polish students will be happy that I was not teaching them at 4 a.m. here in Buffalo. Nobody would have learned anything if that were the case. But I found the Polish students very, very interested in kind of the American style of democracy and the American way of nominating presidential candidates, especially in comparison with some of my American students. Now, that's not all of my American students. I had the good fortune of being able to travel to Iowa with 5 of our political science students in January before COVID kind of shut everything down travel-wise. But it was a great experience, one that I would definitely consider doing again, hopefully in person. We'll see how long Andrew and the University of Warsaw can hopefully keep this running a while yet. But I see Andrew has reappeared, and I'm happy to get to Q&A and allow us some time to answer some questions. So
thank you, Professor Wendland, and we're hopeful that exchanges like this do continue. We do have, of course, our partnership with Canisius College that's been launched this semester. Professor Szklarski is teaching an honors course there on Polish film and history, and he's teaching the course on post-authoritarian democracy here at Daemen College. So we're hopeful that, again, because of the funding from Daemen College, Canisius College, the permanent chair of Polish culture at Canisius College, and of course the Kosciuszko Foundation, opportunities like these exchanges can continue. I want to take the opportunity as chair here to pose the first question to everyone. And I think just pulling together bits and pieces from what you've spoken about, and again, my own experience being in Poland many times and teaching there for some time, I'm interested in what you guys have experienced in the realm of essentially the culture wars, I guess is the phrase that we use both in Poland and here, different terminology, but the way in which the polarization and within the democracy here in America, as well as perhaps the way it's perceived in Poland. I wondered if that came up in your classroom experiences, one, and then secondly, how has that begun to reshape your teaching of democracy in Poland, in America? I'll leave it at that. I do have some follow-up points, but I just wonder if this larger cultural question has become more and more urgent in your engagement with the teaching of democracy. And I'll open this up to Bowden, and then we could work it through the panel. Professor Szklarski, do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Certainly, yes. Thank you for that question. But before I answer it, I have a comment to Bob's first visit when he was in Warsaw at the University of Warsaw. I don't know if you were aware of it, that some of the classics in American literature, people would, if they wanted to buy the books, yes, you know, one of the problems with accessibility of the textbooks or the books for students was the fact that, you know, a monthly salary then in Poland was about $25. Yes, so buying even a cheap penguin piece of literature was out of reach. Yes, but you could buy them from Russian publishers, because Russian publishers would sell Dickens, Melville, you know, the classics, the safe books that are in the canon of international literature, and you can buy them in Poland from the Russian publishing houses, and that's a funny thing, yes, that you would be using a Russian produced textbook, a book in a course taught by American professor in Warsaw. Yes, so just myself was a student at this department, although I at the time when you came to Warsaw, I was already at Northeastern in Boston, so we didn't meet. Now, culture wars. Now uh, we have our own variation of this. Yes, the two dominant cleavages here are women's rights and LGBTQ rights. These are the two issues which dominate in culture wars, Polish style culture wars, Polish issues which are yielding the same kind of polarization, and at the same time polarization between conservative and progressive way of thinking, and at the same time alerting us to the fact of existence of minorities in politics. So the minority which is most often mentioned as a minority is the right currently under the conservative nationalist populist government. It's the LGBTQ groups. Yes, that's the one. Uh, Being a country without sizable other minorities, ethnic, racial minorities, other types of minorities, we do not have that experience of dealing with minorities in our language, in discourse, that you have in the United States. So, for instance, political correctness and its sensitivity to minority issues, rights, sensibilities, and sensitivities, and uh, it may pose some problems for Polish students to when they talk about this. Not necessarily at the American Studies Center, because the student said that you are lucky, or I don't know, lucky or unlucky, to be meeting with students who have been studying American culture, who know pretty well, although not first-hand experience, the culture wars in the United States. They've had tons of courses about culture wars, different aspects of culture wars. Uh, the liberal worldview is absolutely dominating at the American Studies Center, overwhelmingly dominating. So, in this sense, it could be similar to the American academy, at least statistically. Canisius and Daemen might be different a little bit because of at least when the student body is concerned, because of the religious background of both of these universities, and one historically, another one still being a Jesuit college. But the so it is not studied. Culture wars is not an artificial, not an imported issue, uh, and in it is a gateway to the discussion of minority rights. And so in this sense, I think it is similar than to United States.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, thank you for those insights. I wondered what the other faculty here who've taught at the University of Warsaw, what their experiences were, if these were issues that came up.
Yeah, Andrew, I'll just chime in very briefly, and thank you for your remarks now too. But one of the things that really surprised me so much in 1985 through 87, Poland was a very homogeneous place. Um, uh, it was rare that you would see someone who didn't appear to be Polish. In 2018, that had changed a great deal. While there had been some minorities who were, I mean, talking about ethnic national minorities who had been around in Warsaw in the 1980s, Vietnamese in particular, and so forth. It was in 2018. I was just really surprised at the number of restaurants opened up by, for example, South Asians and so forth. The expansion of the Vietnamese that were there, the number of Ukrainians who were there, and because the Erasmus students coming in from lots of different places in Europe. And also those students seem to have, like the Polish students did, that Jay was talking about before, a much greater understanding of their own political systems and healthcare systems that than my, anyway, American students seem to have here. And on my way, well, I should say 1 week before I left for Poland in 2018, I was here in Buffalo at a Babel event where Junot Diaz was the featured speaker. There were 1,948 people who were in attendance, and he wowed, I think, just about everybody that was there. But when I was at JFK waiting to get on a plane to go to Warsaw, news broke that Junot Diaz had been accused of sexual abuse. And this thing just kind of mushroomed. And one of the things that enabled me to do when I was there that I really hadn't planned on was to talk about the kinds of not only cultural wars between, for example, conservatives and liberals and so forth, but also how in the United States, at least in the literature, but I'd say it's more than the literature, there's a kind of further division even within groups that you would somehow think what might otherwise have a great deal in common. And teaching that at that time in 2018, I think gave the students maybe just a little foretaste of where a more diverse Poland could end up if it ended up following the kind of model we following in the United States, where cultural identity has become identity politics and has led to these kinds of divisions, which can get pretty nasty out there.
Thank you, Bob, for those insights. And I know that Lisa, Professor Partial, has some comments. And let me just pause here. I think this will be the final comments from Professor Partial and Professor Wendland. Take your time, folks. I'm not rushing your commentary, but since we're after 7:30, let's leave time for Professor Partial and Professor Wendland, and then we'll wrap up the proceedings. Lisa?
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off the comment. When I was there in 2017, there was a huge pro-gay rights demonstration in Warsaw, and one of the Polish students was working on her thesis that was on the topic of LGBTQ rights in Poland, and had me take a look at it. And I think it was very much what Bob was saying, is kind of this feeling of moving in a more diverse direction in Poland. And then in talking to my students this semester, they're seeing again some of the same things we're seeing here: the liberal conservative divide, but also the rural urban divide. So again, there's very interesting parallels. From what I understand from the students, there's an east-west divide as well. But to your question, Andrew, yeah, we very explicitly tackle in American federalism, of course, we have to, in the issues that we're dealing with, whether it's legalization of marijuana or protest movements of the Black Lives Matter movement, or some of the other kind of contemporary controversies. Yes, very, very much aware of and discussing kind of the current moment of polarization and negative partisanship. And again, I think two crucial case studies where you're seeing interesting parallels going on in both the US and Poland.
Thank you, Lisa. And I think you're right that when you look at the map and voting results, voting patterns in Poland, there is that that east-west divide, if I'm not mistaken. Baden could correct me, but in the area of Przemyśl and down Rzeszów way, that's a conservative area compared to, say, Warsaw or other places you may have been. Professor Wendland, thank you, Baden, for mentioning that. Jay, would you like to add some thoughts here before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'll just add real quickly that near the end of my course was actually approaching the Polish election for president. And a number of my students had kind of worked some of their thoughts on that into some of their responses to my questions that I had posed to them in discussion boards and papers and things like that. And it became very clear to me that the students were very interested in some of these diversity questions along, all sorts of diversity very broadly defined. I know some have mentioned LGBTQ rights. Lisa mentioned the legalization of marijuana. Basically, my students seem very, very interested in exploring these types of issues, and you could see like some skepticism among them about how who, no matter who was elected, how much attention these issues would get, if any, and a lot of kind of consternation with, well, that's just the way things go, which admittedly we see that in America here a bit too, but we've also seen several protests now in both countries where citizens are feeling a bit more empowered, I think, to speak their minds. So I'm curious to see how all of that kind of comes together at the end here, and what kind of changes we start to see.
Thank you, Jay. I'll just add a final comment about my own teaching experience in 2019 at the University of Warsaw, teaching a course in environmental history. And the environment, of course, is a topic of universal interest, of universal concern. And that was a very interesting experience to sort of, translate the American experience to these students in a way that I think was especially meaningful given the realities of the 21st century environmental issues. Well, those are just some closing thoughts about my own experience there. I really appreciate Professor Szklarski and all of my colleagues here at Daemen who have taken part in the exchange program with the University of Warsaw, the American Studies Center there. Thank you all for sharing your insights, your thoughts. I think there's much more that could be said, of course, but I'm delighted that you gave us all something to think about. And there's nothing more important to talk about, frankly, from my perspective now, than the experiences of these democracies in the 21st century as we grapple with all these different issues that you guys mentioned in your presentation. So thank you all very much. Thank you to the audience for your patience and for your attendance. And thank you once again to all the sponsors and collaborators that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Thank you. Good night. We hope to see you again in a future presentation. Take care.
Good night. Bye-bye. Thank you.